I was halfway through my morning coffee, reviewing the client presentation I'd spent 2 weeks perfecting, when my manager walked into my office without knocking. "Great news," Troy Bennett said with that practiced enthusiasm that always made me uneasy. "We're bringing on a new team member, and I'd like you to mentor them starting this afternoon. Really showcase your leadership skills." I smiled automatically, assuming this was about team expansion, maybe even my promotion finally coming through. Then he added the part that made my stomach drop into my shoes. "They'll be learning your role, your processes, everything you do day to day. I want a complete knowledge transfer." The words hung in the air between us while my brain struggled to process them. Training someone in my role. Complete knowledge transfer. I was being replaced, and he was making me do it myself. My hands tightened around my coffee mug as Troy continued talking about timelines and expectations like this was perfectly normal, like he hadn't just told me I was erasing myself. Troy's smile never wavered as he explained the training plan, but something about his eyes felt off. Too bright, too fixed, like he was performing rather than communicating. I tried to ask about my future role, about where I fit in this expansion plan, about what happens after the training. Each question was met with smooth deflection. "Let's focus on the immediate task," he said, still smiling. "We'll discuss next steps once the new hire is up to speed." But there was no warmth in his voice, no reassurance, just carefully maintained ambiguity designed to keep me compliant. "Is my position changing?" I asked directly, needing something concrete. "We're evolving the team structure," he replied, which wasn't an answer at all. "Just stay focused on showing strong leadership through this transition." Transition to what? I wanted to scream. Instead, I nodded professionally and watched him leave my office. The door closed behind him, and I sat there staring at my computer screen, clarity being deliberately withheld from me while I was expected to cooperate with my own replacement. At 2 that afternoon, I met Bethany Pierce in the conference room. She was young, maybe mid-20s, nervous but eager, with a portfolio folder clutched against her chest like armor. "I'm so excited to learn from you," she said genuinely. "Troy said you're the best at what you do." My anger collided violently with guilt. This wasn't her fault. She'd accepted a job opportunity, probably thrilled about it, completely unaware that she was replacing someone who still worked here, who was being forced to train her without explanation or dignity. I smiled anyway, because what else could I do? Refuse and look unprofessional? Make a scene and confirm whatever narrative Troy was building about me? "Welcome to the team," I said, hearing how hollow my voice sounded. We spent 3 hours that afternoon going through my daily responsibilities. Every process I explained, every password I shared, every client relationship I described felt like I was actively erasing myself. By 5 o'clock, my face hurt from maintaining the professional mask. Bethany thanked me enthusiastically, completely oblivious to the funeral she'd just attended. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table checking my work email obsessively, waiting for some message that would clarify what was happening. An explanation. A timeline. Some acknowledged that this situation was unusual and deserved transparency. Nothing came. Just silence that felt increasingly intentional. My phone stayed dark except for a notification about tomorrow's training session, scheduled without asking if I was available. I opened my sent emails and reread my recent messages to Troy, looking for something I'd missed, some warning sign that I'd failed or disappointed him. My performance reviews had been consistently excellent. My client feedback was positive. My projects met deadlines and exceeded targets. There was no obvious reason for this, which somehow made it worse. If I'd failed, at least I could understand it. This felt arbitrary, cruel, like I was being removed not for what I'd done wrong but for reasons I'd never be told. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by anxiety spiraling through scenarios I couldn't control. Over the next few days, I started noticing changes I'd been too busy to see before. The Henderson account, which I'd managed for 2 years, was reassigned to another team member without discussion. Project meetings I'd always attended disappeared from my calendar. Strategic planning sessions happened without me. Each exclusion felt minor in isolation, designed to be plausibly deniable. But together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. I was being systematically removed from everything that had defined my role. On Wednesday, I walked past the conference room and saw Bethany presenting my client strategy to the leadership team. My strategy, my research, my recommendations, being delivered by someone who'd learned it from me 3 days ago. Troy stood at the back of the room, nodding approvingly. When I asked him about it later, he said it was a good development opportunity for Bethany. The dismissal in his tone made it clear my contributions weren't valued anymore. I was becoming invisible in my own job, erased piece by piece while everyone pretended it wasn't happening. Friday morning, I finally confronted Troy directly. I couldn't stand the ambiguity anymore. Is my job at risk? I asked, keeping my voice level despite the anxiety churning in my stomach. He actually laughed. Not a nervous laugh, but a dismissive one that made me feel small and paranoid. You're reading way too much into this, he said, shaking his head like I was being ridiculous. Bethany's here to support the team, not replace anyone. You're creating problems where they don't exist. But his words contradicted everything I was experiencing. If she was supported, why was I training her in my exact role? If I wasn't being replaced, why were my responsibilities disappearing? The gaslighting was almost perfect, making me doubt my own perception even though the evidence was undeniable. I just need to understand the plan, I tried again. There's no plan beyond what I've told you, Troy replied impatiently. Focus on doing your job instead of worrying about everyone else's. The conversation ended with me feeling dismissed and foolish for asking legitimate questions. I stopped asking after that. What was the point when clarity was being weaponized against me? The training sessions intensified over the following week. What had started as high-level overviews became detailed documentation requests. Bethany needed access to every system, every client file, every process document. She needed my passwords, my contacts, my strategic plans. Troy wants comprehensive transition materials, she explained apologetically, clearly uncomfortable with how extractive this was becoming. I wasn't mentoring anymore. I was being systematically stripped for parts, every piece of knowledge and access pulled out and handed to someone else. Each session left me feeling more hollow. Tuesday was client relationship protocols. Wednesday was budget management systems. Thursday was crisis response procedures. Friday was strategic planning frameworks. By the end of each day, I'd taught Bethany something essential that made me slightly more replaceable. The worst part was maintaining the professional facade. Acting like this was normal career development instead of the slow dismantling of my position. My smile muscles ached from the constant performance of being fine when nothing was fine. On Monday morning, Troy sent an urgent email. The training needed to be completed within 2 weeks, not the vague timeline he'd originally mentioned. 2 weeks to document everything I'd built over 4 years. The deadline wasn't a suggestion, it was an ultimatum disguised as a request. I stared at my screen, understanding crystallizing with painful clarity. This wasn't open-ended team development. There was an end date to this process, and that end date was when I became completely expendable. The aggressive timeline suggested something else too. Whatever was coming, it was happening soon. Troy needed Bethany ready to take over immediately because my departure wasn't some distant possibility. It was imminent, planned, probably already decided at levels above Troy that I'd never see. I pulled up my calendar and counted the days. If training finished in 2 weeks, how long after that would I last? A week? 2 days? Would I even get notice, or would it be like the training announcement, casual and devastating, dropped into a normal morning like a bomb disguised as routine communication? The nights became unbearable. I'd come home exhausted from performing normalcy all day, training my replacement with professional composure while internally screaming. Sleep fragmented into anxious hours of replaying conversations, analyzing every interaction with Troy, trying to identify what I'd done wrong. My confidence, built over years of strong performance, cracked under the weight of sustained uncertainty. I stopped eating regular meals, surviving on coffee and the kind of snacks you grab without thinking. My apartment felt smaller, suffocating, filled with the presence of problems I couldn't solve. Friends asked if I was okay. I lied automatically, too tired to explain and too proud to admit I was being pushed out of a job I'd excelled at. The isolation compounded everything else. I was drowning in a situation nobody else could see, performing strength I didn't feel, waiting for an axe to fall that everyone pretended wasn't hanging over my head. Some mornings, getting out of bed felt impossible. But I did it anyway, because what choice did I have? Instead of confronting Troy again or making desperate appeals to HR, I started protecting myself quietly. Every evening after Bethany left, I saved copies of my work to personal drives. Project timelines showing my contributions. Client emails praising my performance. Strategic documents with my name on them. Approval chains demonstrating my role in major decisions. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preserving evidence that I'd existed, that I'd contributed, that this job hadn't always been Bethany's. It was self-preservation in digital form, insurance against being erased so completely that even I might start believing I'd never been valuable. I documented training session dates, noting what I'd taught and when. I saved Troy's emails with their vague language and missing explanations. I created a timeline of my responsibilities being reassigned. Not because I knew what I'd do with it, but because losing everything without record felt like dying without witnesses. The documentation was the only thing that gave me any sense of control in a situation designed to make me powerless. Troy's behavior became increasingly contradictory. In team meetings, he'd praise my work loudly and publicly. "Nobody handles client relationships like you do," he'd announce, smiling at me across the conference table. Then privately, he'd exclude me from client meetings, reassign my projects, and accelerate my replacement's training. The contradiction was deliberate, I realized. Public praise maintained his image as a supportive manager while private actions achieved his actual goal of removing me. Optics mattered more than truth. To the broader team, he looked like he valued me. To anyone paying close attention, his actions told a different story entirely. But most people don't pay close attention. They hear the public statements and assume they reflect reality. I watched colleagues accept Troy's narrative without question, never noticing that my role was shrinking while my supposed value was being praised. The gaslighting worked because he played both sides perfectly, making me look paranoid if I complained while systematically dismantling my position where it wouldn't be noticed. On Thursday afternoon, a colleague named Oliver stopped me in the hallway outside the break room. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "Why are you training someone to do your exact job? That seems really weird." Hearing the situation described by someone else made it undeniable in a way my own thoughts couldn't achieve. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't a misinterpretation. It was objectively strange, and someone else had noticed. "Troy said it's team development," I replied carefully, testing how much I could say. Oliver's expression told me everything. The skepticism, the concern, the unspoken acknowledgement that we both knew what was really happening. "That's not what team development looks like," he said bluntly. "That's what replacement looks like. Are you okay?" I wasn't okay, but admitting it felt dangerous. "I'm handling it," I said instead. Oliver nodded slowly. "If you need a reference or want to talk, let me know." His offer was kind, but it also confirmed my worst fear. Even my colleagues could see I was being pushed out. That night, sitting in my apartment with the city lights blinking through my window, I opened my laptop and pulled up my resume. The document hadn't been updated in 4 years, still showing the job I'd left to join this company, the optimism I'd felt accepting what seemed like an opportunity. Updating it felt like admitting defeat, like accepting that Troy had won and I was giving up. But it also felt like reclaiming something. Control. Agency. Choice. If they were going to push me out, I'd leave on my own terms, find something better, refuse to be the victim in their narrative. I spent 3 hours rewriting my experience, highlighting accomplishments Troy seemed determined to forget. Client accounts grown by 40%. Strategic initiatives that saved the company significant money. Team leadership that others had praised even if Troy now dismissed it. By midnight, I had a resume that reminded me of my own value, something I'd almost forgotten under weeks of systematic devaluation. I saved it with tomorrow's date in the file name. It felt like drawing a line, marking when I stopped accepting and started acting. I applied to 6 positions that weekend, carefully selecting companies that valued expertise over politics. On Tuesday, I had a phone interview that reminded me what professional respect felt like. The hiring manager asked intelligent questions about my strategic approach, my client management philosophy, my leadership style. She listened to my answers and followed up with thoughtful discussion instead of dismissive deflection. "Your experience is exactly what we're looking for," she said before ending the call. "I'd like to schedule an in-person interview this week if you're available." Walking out of the conference room where I'd taken the call, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Steadiness. Solid ground beneath my feet instead of the constant sensation of falling. Maybe I wasn't the problem. Maybe Troy's treatment said more about him than it did about my abilities. Other organizations saw value in what I offered. Other managers wanted what Troy was throwing away. The interview had reminded me that this company wasn't the only place I could work, that my career didn't end with Troy's dismissal. It was just transitioning somewhere better, somewhere I'd be valued instead of erased. The offer came Thursday morning, faster than I'd expected. Senior account manager, direct reports, 20% salary increase, better benefits, immediate start date available. I read the email 3 times, feeling the fear that had gripped me for weeks finally loosen its hold. This was real. This was better than what I had. And most importantly, this was my choice. For the first time since Troy had announced the training plan, I felt like I had power in this situation. I wasn't waiting to be discarded. I was choosing to leave before they could finish pushing me out. I called the hiring manager back and accepted the offer immediately, negotiating a start date 3 weeks out to give proper notice. When I hung up, I sat at my desk staring at the acceptance email I'd just sent, feeling something unexpected. Relief, yes, but also satisfaction. Troy thought he was controlling my exit. He had no idea I was about to control the timing in ways that would make his plan collapse. The deadline he'd set for completing my training was 2 weeks away. My resignation would come right in the middle of it. I completed training sessions over the following days with new calm. Bethany asked questions, and I answered them professionally, teaching her what she needed without revealing what I knew about my impending departure. On Monday, we covered client emergency protocols. Tuesday was budget reconciliation processes. Wednesday was strategic planning frameworks. Troy watched these sessions closely, clearly relieved that I was cooperating fully, that his plan was proceeding smoothly toward the conclusion he'd envisioned. He had no idea the timeline was about to shift dramatically in my favor. During Thursday's session, he actually thanked me for being such a team player during this transition. I smiled and nodded, thinking about the resignation letter saved on my personal laptop at home, scheduled to be sent Monday morning. His confidence was about to become his biggest problem. Everything he'd planned depended on me staying through the deadline, finishing the knowledge transfer, making Bethany fully prepared. He'd never considered I might leave before that process completed, taking critical knowledge with me that couldn't be documented in 2 weeks of training. Monday morning, I arrived at the office an hour early. I opened my laptop, pulled up the resignation letter I'd drafted over the weekend, and read it one final time. Professional. Brief. Unemotional. 2 weeks' notice as required by my contract. I copied Troy, HR, and the department head, then clicked send before I could second-guess myself. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Within 20 minutes, Troy appeared at my office door. His confident expression had cracked, replaced by something between confusion and panic. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice tight. We went to his office. He closed the door and stood there for a moment, clearly trying to process what my resignation meant for his plans. "This timing is really unfortunate," he finally said, which was possibly the understatement of the year. "We're in the middle of crucial training. Can you extend your notice period?" "My contract requires 2 weeks," I replied calmly. "I'm providing exactly that." The realization was dawning on him now. 2 weeks wasn't enough. Bethany wasn't ready. His deadline was approaching, and suddenly he didn't have the person he needed to meet it. The power dynamic had just reversed completely, and we both knew it. Within 3 days, problems started surfacing. Bethany reached out constantly with questions about processes I hadn't had time to cover. Client emails piled up requiring context she didn't have. Troy held emergency meetings trying to accelerate the knowledge transfer, but 2 weeks couldn't contain 4 years of expertise. The Henderson account had a crisis on Wednesday. Bethany didn't know the client history or the relationship dynamics. She made decisions that contradicted promises I'd made months ago, confusing the client and creating tension. Troy had to intervene personally, something he rarely did, exposing how unprepared the transition really was. Another project deadline approached, and Bethany couldn't locate documentation she needed. I'd kept those files organized in systems she hadn't been trained on because Troy's rushed timeline hadn't allowed for comprehensive technical training. My phone stayed silent during all of this. Bethany could have called or texted asking for help. Troy could have requested additional support. But I'd resigned. I didn't work there anymore in any meaningful sense. I was just finishing my contractual obligation, and that obligation didn't include saving them from problems they'd created. On my second to last day, Troy called me into his office. The confidence that had defined him weeks ago was completely gone, replaced by visible stress. "I need to ask a favor," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. "The Marshall Project deadline is Friday, and Bethany's still getting up to speed. Could you help her through it? Just to get us past this deadline?" The strain in his voice was obvious. He was desperate, realizing too late that replacing someone competent required more than 2 weeks of rushed training. I looked at him, remembering how he'd dismissed my questions, gaslit my concerns, stripped away my responsibilities while praising me publicly. How he'd made me train my own replacement without transparency or basic professional respect. "I don't work here after tomorrow," I said calmly. "The Marshall Project isn't my responsibility anymore." The silence that followed said everything. He'd expected me to save him, to put the company above my own interests the way I always had before. The realization that I wouldn't was clearly stunning to him. "We really need your help," he tried again. "No," I replied simply, and walked out. My last day was Friday. I packed my personal items, returned my access badge and laptop, and completed exit paperwork with HR. No dramatic speeches. No burned bridges. Just a quiet, professional departure that left Troy scrambling to cover responsibilities he'd thought would be seamlessly transferred. Bethany looked stressed and overwhelmed, dealing with questions she couldn't answer and expectations she couldn't meet. I felt bad for her. This wasn't her fault. She'd accepted a job without knowing she was being used as part of someone else's removal. But that wasn't my problem to solve anymore. On Monday, the Marshall Project deadline arrived. I knew this because Oliver texted me. "Complete disaster," he wrote. "Client called an emergency meeting. Bethany couldn't answer basic questions. Troy's getting destroyed by leadership." The deadline I'd been removed from, the project that had been reassigned, the transition that was supposed to be smooth, all of it had collapsed spectacularly. Not because Bethany was incompetent, but because Troy had tried to transfer years of expertise in weeks while simultaneously pushing out the person who held that expertise. The consequences escalated quickly. The Marshall client, frustrated by the botched deadline and lack of continuity, threatened to move their account to a competitor. That account represented 15% of the department's revenue. Leadership demanded explanations, not from Bethany but from Troy, the architect of this failed transition. Oliver kept me updated through text messages I never asked for but appreciated anyway. Internal review happening, he wrote on Wednesday. They're asking why knowledge transfer was rushed. Why you weren't kept on longer. Troy's getting grilled. Another message Thursday, client formally complained. Said transition was unprofessional. Leadership wants documentation of how this was managed. By Friday, VP is reviewing Troy's decisions. Your personnel file got pulled. They're comparing what he told them versus what actually happened. The truth was emerging naturally, not because I'd complained or filed grievances, but because the failed deadline had forced people to look carefully at what Troy had done and why. The evidence spoke for itself. Rushed replacement. Inadequate training. Valued employee pushed out without proper transition. The disaster had made his poor management undeniable. The internal review apparently uncovered exactly what had happened. Knowledge had been forcibly extracted from one person through rushed, inadequate training. No transition plan existed beyond make them train their replacement. No consideration had been given to how long expertise actually takes to develop. Troy had prioritized his timeline over organizational stability, and the Marshall deadline had exposed that choice publicly. Oliver forwarded me parts of the review documentation, probably violating company policy but clearly feeling I deserved to know. Management failed to implement appropriate succession planning, one section read. Critical knowledge was concentrated in a single employee, and removal of that employee was executed without adequate risk mitigation. Another section noted, the decision to replace a high-performing employee was poorly justified and inadequately executed, resulting in client dissatisfaction and revenue risk. Troy's decisions were now officially documented as failures. Not opinions or conflicts, but measured, institutional acknowledgement that he'd mismanaged the situation. The vindication felt distant, almost abstract. I wasn't angry anymore. I'd moved past it. But knowing the truth was on record mattered somehow. 3 weeks after I left, Oliver called instead of texting. Troy's gone, he said without preamble. Not fired exactly, but reassigned to some administrative role. No team. No direct reports. Basically kicked upstairs until he finds something else or leaves. The news landed strangely. I'd spent weeks feeling powerless, watching Troy systematically remove me while maintaining perfect plausibility. Now he'd been removed the same way, quietly and without announcement, his position eliminated just as mine had been. The symmetry was almost poetic. How's Bethany? I asked, genuinely curious. Actually okay, Oliver replied. They brought in someone senior to support her, and she's learning properly now instead of being thrown in the deep end. She's relieved, honestly. The pressure was crushing her. So Bethany survived. The Marshall client eventually stayed after leadership personally managed the relationship repair. The department continued functioning. But Troy, the architect of the failed transition, was gone. Not because I'd destroyed him or sought revenge, but because his decisions had natural consequences that caught up faster than he'd expected. Sometimes justice doesn't require your active participation. Sometimes it just requires stepping aside and letting people face what they've created. My first day at the new company felt surreal. The onboarding was respectful and thorough. My new manager, Clarissa, actually asked about my previous experience and listened to my answers. She introduced me to the team as someone whose expertise was valued, not someone to be managed out. In my first team meeting, people asked for my input on a client strategy. They listened when I spoke. They built on my ideas instead of dismissing them. The contrast with my final months at the previous company was startling and painful. I'd forgotten what it felt like to work somewhere that valued competence instead of viewing it as a threat. I'd become so accustomed to Troy's treatment that I'd started believing maybe I deserved it, maybe I was the problem. Being in an environment that treated me professionally reminded me how abnormal the previous situation had been. That afternoon, Clarissa stopped by my desk. "Glad you're here," she said simply. "We're lucky to have your experience." It was a small comment, probably routine for her. But after months of being systematically devalued, hearing it meant everything. Sitting in my new office weeks later, I reflected on everything that had happened. The shock of Troy's announcement. The humiliation of training my replacement. The gaslighting and exclusion. The decision to leave. The deadline disaster. Troy's removal. My fresh start. I'd learned something crucial through all of it: loyalty can be mistaken for compliance if you're not careful. I'd been loyal to the company, loyal to my work, loyal to professional standards even when Troy stripped away my responsibilities. That loyalty had been exploited, used against me, mistaken for weakness that would keep me compliant through my own removal. But loyalty to a company or manager isn't the same as loyalty to yourself. Walking away when you're being mistreated isn't disloyalty. It's self-respect. I hadn't won by destroying anyone or seeking dramatic revenge. I'd won by walking away intact while the truth caught up on its own. Troy had tried to replace me quietly, assuming I'd cooperate through the entire process. Instead, I'd left on my terms, letting his plan collapse under its own inadequacy. That was victory enough. Not loud or dramatic, but complete. I'd reclaimed my career, my confidence, and my understanding that being replaceable at one company doesn't make you less valuable. It just means you're working at the wrong company. And now I wasn't anymore.